Hey everyone. I recently sat down and talked to Robert Elias, who's a professor and author of many baseball books, including The Empire Strikes Out and Baseball Rebels. But we mostly talk about his latest book, Dangerous Danny Gardella. Danny Gardella is one of those ball players with a fascinating story, but somebody who we don't hear about too much. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Here's the interview. Rob,
Hi, Ben. How are you?
I'm doing well. How about you?
Good. Can you hear me okay?
I can. So I'm curious, what's the field behind you?
It's Oracle, the latest name for the Giants ballpark.
Okay. Okay.
Hmm.
Right. Well, one thing I really liked about your book was really including the context, like as you were telling the story of Gardella, like what was going on in the U.S. and in the world at that time, and really giving a good setting and how the pieces really connected. And so, just to start off, and I'm always interested in this from authors because I know how much it takes to complete a project. And for you to really start with this idea and say, okay, I'm going to follow through with this. I'm going to do the research. I'm going to put this book together, however long it takes. You know, what for you really gave you that motivation and allowed you to continue through the project?
Well, I had done a book fairly recently, actually two books. It was a two-book series with a colleague of mine, Peter Dreyer, and we did a couple of books. One Major League Rebels, the other Baseball Rebels. And I thought that even after that, I had at least another book in me. So I was looking around for something to do. I had written a previous book, the Empire Strikes Out, which was a history of baseball's relationship with U.S. foreign and military policy. And that's really where I think I first came across Gardella. And it had to do with many of the U.S. Military interventions where baseball accompanied the interventions, sometimes occupations. And in the case of Mexico, Gardella came up, and so I was kind of curious there. And then then Peter and I did these other two more recent books, he came up again as someone who was challenging the wage slavery, what he called it, the wage slavery of Major League Baseball under the Reserve Clause. And I thought to myself, there seems like there's something more here than just these sort of offhand references. And the more I looked, the more interesting it got, the whole story of how he actually came to challenge Major League Baseball. And then, in addition to that, I found out he was such an interesting character. He was a high school dropout, but was in many ways a Renaissance man. He was a poet. Quoted Shakespeare and Edgar Allan Poe. He was an acrobat. He was a weight training and nutrition pioneer. All these other things that were a part of his life made him a really interesting character. He was a Golden Gloves boxer, and so many other things. So I thought this was a really interesting guy, and he made, I think, a big impact on the game that was, I think, pretty neglected. And so that was my idea behind telling his story.
I mean, your title is Dangerous Danny, right? Danny Gardella. Do you see, I mean, he with his lawsuit, which we'll get into, we often fear what we don't understand. And you're talking about so many of the things that he did. Like, was that part of this idea too? Like, people didn't understand the way he behaved and what he did, which made him more dangerous. Like, I feel like that's part of it.
Well, the amazing thing, and I say this in the book, is that, especially in previous decades, ball players were inclined to get labeled with a nickname, maybe two nicknames at the most, usually, unless you were a big star. And Gardella had about 33 nicknames that he was given by players and sports writers and other people. And it really was a reflection of the kind of character he was. But the one that really stood out was Dangerous Danny Gardella, and he was repeatedly referred to as that. And so, how is he dangerous? Well, he had some fielding flaws in the outfield, and so it wasn't clear whether he'd get bopped on the head sometimes when he was trying to catch a fly ball. So he was dangerous there. He was an acrobat, and he was always doing these stunts, both on the field and off the field. So was he going to kill himself doing this? But most importantly, he was dangerous because he threatened the business model of Major League Baseball. That was the really big danger here is that this guy's just sort of come out of the blue and decided he wasn't going to go along with the contract the way it was written up.
And when in reading your book, I mean, this is maybe a little thing, but I'm like he came from a working class family, right?
Yes,
And in I think it was 19, like he was 13 years old when he attended um this arts academy. Like how would that have happened?
he was always dissatisfied with school, and maybe a little bit arrogantly. Um, he always thought that he knew more than the teachers, and that they weren't really approaching education the way he wanted to. They weren't studying the things, or at least the things that he thought was important. And so he broke off from that. I mean, and ultimately he dropped out from school. But even before that, he was looking for other things. And I think you get this sense about him generally. He always seemed to be seeking other things. And so he got involved in all these different directions. And that was one of the earliest ones, is breaking away to see if he could become an actor.
So it's like and his initiative as a 13-year-old, he's like, I want to go attend this academy, this arts academy, and that's how he ended up going there. And is that right?
Yes. Well, he was, he was influenced, I think, maybe by some other folks, but it was an option he heard about, and he was living in the Bronx. He went into Manhattan and found this school. It turned out to be a pretty well known school, and gave it a shot. And then later on in his after baseball, he gave it another shot. He gave a lot of things a shot because he had a lot of sort of talents, but then it seemed like he didn't really have the resources or support to really take them further aside from what he did in baseball.
Oh, those things where he did have the resources, reading, like he was an avid reader, and this was one of the things that he would do that set him apart on the field or in the dugout, right? Like he would
Right.
constantly read or sing, right? Like, can you talk
Exactly.
about some other things or elaborate on that he would do as a
Hmm.
ball player that would kind of make people go like, oh, what was this guy doing?
Yeah, well, you can imagine the ball players for the most part, when they were traveling, for example, they played cards, or maybe they read, comic books, or adventure stories, Western stories, stuff like that. And Gardella would bring along these heavy psychology books, or books of poetry, or Shakespeare's plays. One player said that he insisted that Gardella brought the Encyclopedia Britannica with him every time they went on a road trip. An exaggeration, but you could see how he was kind of regarded as really kind of different. Like, well, what are you doing? What is that you're reading over there that we're not doing? And then the singing, he was singing all the time. He was singing in the dugout. He would sing in the field. He would roam the streets after a game and sing. He'd try to wiggle his way into various performances in different hotels or high schools that he was near. So he was just an odd character who was just a free spirit, and he didn't let anybody sort of get in his way. He also did a lot of acrobatic stunts because he was a true acrobat. He could walk on his hands. Some say faster than many of his fellow players could run. And he did all these stunts. These one-armed handstands on his bedpost or on the dugout. He'd hang from train trestles and hang out the side of the window of skyscrapers. He did a lot of crazy things, but it was all a part of, I think, this sense that he was a free spirit. He was young. He was a giant, and he could have a blast, and he didn't hold back.
I could see, today as a child, he would maybe be diagnosed with ADHD, It's like, oh,
Exactly.
he's got too many things going on. He just has like he's so open to these different facets, and it just he's like what's the word I'm thinking of? Ravenous
Hmm.
for, taking in these different pursuits. Can you talk a little more? Because this was in your book about this incident or one incident of hanging from the train tracks or train trellises when a train would happen, and what happened because he did that.
Yeah, yeah. He was playing. This was in the few years that he played in the minors. He was playing for a team in the South, and he decided to go fishing, and then after he was fishing, he was going to cross this train trestle, and he I guess he got about halfway across, and he heard that a train was coming. Well, normally you would run to the other end of the train trestle so that you were off the trestle by the time the train came, but he was aside from being a little crazy, he was immensely strong and was again in the acrobat mode. And so what he did is just he lowered himself down below the tracks and just sort of held on over the river below. And he didn't think it would be much of a problem. It was a very long train, unexpectedly, freight train. So it really tested even the great strength that he had. He did manage to hold on while the train finally passed over him, but he was exhausted, and he went back. And they were playing. They were going to play a game later that day, and he said to his manager, I don't think I can play. And the manager was not happy when he learned, the stunt he had pulled. And the next day, he was traded to another team. So whether that was in the works or not, anyway, you get the sense that some of his managers didn't have much tolerance for some of his antics. Let's put it that way.
I mean, like I got the impression, I mean, he was clearly unique, but some of the things that he did, one or two of those things would have enormously set him apart. To be, I don't know if he was a vegetarian, like in terms of his diet, at least for a while, right?
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah,
at the
he
time,
was.
I'm sure that was unheard of.
There were several things. Yes, to be a vegetarian among, basically steak eaters. Uh, and, he would put together these concoctions. Some people think he invented the smoothie, as a matter of
Hmm.
fact. Um, and he also was very into weight training. That's why he was so strong. And at the time, this was very, very frowned upon by the major league teams. And other people who tried it actually were told to stop. And it was thought that if you got bulked up, muscle bound, that you would be too inflexible to be successful in baseball. Now, of course, these days everyone does everyone does that. And he said, you're crazy. That's going to improve my performance, not make it worse. And so, in a way, he was a pioneer in a few different things.
And you also have this story of him, the players are taking the field and he's staring up at the moon and kind of reflecting on nature and how lovely it
Hmm.
is with the moonlight,
Right.
and that's what he wants to do, and the manager's like, get the hell out there, right? He's like, I'd rather stare at the moon, right? He's just into what's
Yeah.
going on around him and very present.
Yeah, I mean, he was a very talented ball player, but if he had maybe more of the focus and single-mindedness, he might have been able to be even better ball player. But he was distracted, and his brother recognized this and talked about it as well. He said, Danny is just he's always looking for something else, always looking for something new, and Danny's brother was also a ball player, Al Gardella. So he could observe in many ways Danny firsthand as to how committed he was to baseball.
I think this is really interesting because it's like through your book and just through the story and what he's able to do, you get these glimpses of someone, and he did have an impact, and we're going to continue to talk about that. But it's like, I mean, this is true for millions, if not billions, of people born, you know, in the wrong time where he doesn't have access. And I'm thinking today, there are these schools around me. There's a Sudbury school, and these schools where children go and they're allowed to really, um, vote on the classes. They're allowed to determine who their teachers are and what subjects they're going to learn. And
Right.
like that would have been great for him,
Hmm.
to have those opportunities. And who knows what more he could have done if he had those opportunities and those resources.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I think in so many realms, he could have maybe had more of a singing career, even an opera career. He was an excellent opera singer. Uh, but, he just didn't have the mechanism for, breaking in and really showing his talents. So I think you're right about that. Born in the wrong time.
Yeah, yeah. Well, can you talk about what led up to the trial and his impact and Kurt Flood and what later happened with free agency?
Sure. So it starts really with the contract. All the major league teams had been collaborating on a common contract, and in that contract was a reserve clause. And the reserve clause said that you play for us this year, but we also reserve you for the next year. So it was a very stacked in favor of the team owners. They could drop you with 10 days notice and cancel the contract, but you were obliged to stay with them or to any team that you were sold to or traded to, in which case you became the property of that team. So it not only was a kind of bondage that you had to deal with, but it really suppressed wages because you couldn't sell your services, your skills to other teams with the hope of getting a better deal. And that was the whole idea behind the collaboration and really the collusion among the teams. Major league teams have really been a monopoly for the sport, and you could say that they would be covered by the antitrust laws. And the antitrust laws forbid collusion, assuming the laws are enforced. They forbid collusion of the sort of the kind of contract that these teams were imposing on the players. But the antitrust laws, although they were around since 1890, were poorly enforced. And in particular, there was a decision in 1922, the Supreme Court decided essentially that baseball was exempt from the antitrust laws. So basically, it gave a free rein for the teams to continue to do this. So there were some, pushback along the way against the reserve clause, but it made it very difficult to succeed. Players would hold out, but basically, in the end, they'd have to sign anyway. They didn't have an alternative. So the only alternative would be if there was another competing major league. And this happened a few times, but these competing leagues were usually quickly defeated, and then the players were back to the reserve clause and being bound to their teams again. So along comes Danny Gardella, and in 1945 he had a very good season for the New York Giants and expected a good raise, was given what he thought was a very, very meager raise, and he pushed back. And the Giants were not in the mood to hear about this, and they marginalized him initially, and then they announced that they were going to sell him to the minor leagues. So prior to that season, 1946 season, he was working in an upscale gym in New York City, Al Ruin's gym, as a masseuse and trainer. And he met a guy named Jorge Pascal, Mexican who owned a team in the Mexican League, and Pascal essentially ran the Mexican League. And he was flabbergasted when he heard what little the Giants were paying Gardella. And he said, if you want to play for my team, I'll pay you a lot more than that. And Gardella paid no attention until a couple of months later, he began to run into problems with getting a new contract, from the Giants. So there was a bit of conflict that went on during spring training, and ultimately Gardella said, "Well, the hell with you. I'm going to go and play in Mexico." And so he went, but he also lured other players from the major leagues. I think around 25 to 27 ball players total. leaving because they would be free from the reserve clause and they would get much higher salaries than were being paid by Major League Baseball. So this became a big threat because it was challenging the MLB's business model. And so the commissioner, Chandler, decided to issue a ban, a 5-year ban, which is really a lifetime for a major league ball player. But um, it was designed to punish the people who had jumped, but also to try to deter others, because Pascal was really on a campaign to try to lure as many people as he could. So Gardella went. He got these other jumpers to go with them. When he and others tried to go back after playing in the Mexican League, they found themselves unable to earn a livelihood playing baseball. And this meant not just as a major leaguer, but also as a minor leaguer, and ultimately as a semi-pro player. And that's where things came to a head with Gardella. Gardella was called out in a game in Staten Island. It's a semi-pro game he was playing there, and he decided that he had to fight back, and so he filed suit. And ultimately, this went to court. And I can talk to you about that court case if you want.
Yeah. So what was it? It was like he was offered a $5,000 contract and he wasn't satisfied. And then what did he make in the Mexican League?
Oh, he made at least 10,000 with an option for at least another year, maybe 2 years after that. So he was making more and had the prospect of making a lot more as time went on. So yeah, so it was attractive, and he was in a situation where things were not apparently going to work out with the Giants, even though he had a good experience with the Giants the previous season, and for part of the previous season before that as well. He played for a couple of years with the Giants.
So, when the trial comes about, it seems like most of the big time people are against him and other people in his situation. Major League Baseball, the commissioner, uh, the press, right? They were all against him. Is that right?
Yeah, sure. Certainly, the team owners were opposed to him, and almost all the sports writers. There were a few exceptions. But was I think most troubling is that most of the players seem to be against him as well. Um, they were really passive in this. They didn't really come to grips with the value they were creating for the owners, and they looked at Gardella as sort of disrupting their situation, even though virtually all of them had to have second or third jobs in the off season in order to get by. I mean, it should have sunk in. This came home, I think, later on. When Marvin Miller took over the union in 1966, he was flabbergasted also that the players seemed to be so oblivious to the value they were producing, and the passivity they were engaging in. And they really had to have their consciousness sort of raised, and that was what part of what Miller and then Kurt Flood actually accomplished. But back in Gardella's time, he had to push back essentially against all of these forces against him, and even at a certain point, some of the players who were also banned also came out against him pursuing this lawsuit because they felt that that was the impediment to Chandler canceling the ban and allowing them back into Major League Baseball. So he really had to fight against a lot of opposition here. It took a lot of courage, I think, to do this.
I mean, and that right there is to me that makes a good story, and I can see like the makings of a film with that, because right, it's like I kind of see that Braveheart moment when you know William Wallace is on the ground and the guy removes his mask, and it's like you betrayed me too. you know, because right, Danny
Exactly.
Gardella is like all these people he's up against so much, and all of a sudden these people who are supposed to be with him are turning their backs on him, and that's really hard. So,
Hmm.
do you know? Like, I'm curious. And it sounds like the players overall are oblivious to how much Major League Baseball is making at the time, which and so they don't know how much they could actually get. And I'm wondering, and I don't know you have these numbers or where they would be, but like w- what was an average salary at the time? He was getting $5,000 for his contract, versus what baseball could handle in terms of paying players more.
Yeah, I don't have exact numbers, but there were players that a lot of players that were being paid as little as $2,000. So he had a good year. He was he's one of the National League leaders in home runs in 1945, and he batted cleanup for the Giants that year. He won a number of ball games with late inning home runs. He felt that he was deserving of something that was significantly more. But overall, the players were, except for the occasional stars, they were really paid poorly at a time when the owners were making a lot of money.
Yeah.
Even during World War II, there was only one year where there was a a noticeable downturn in the proceeds for the owners. And then there was a big sort of uptick after the war, in late 1945 and then 1946, 1947. So the owners had a lot of money to spend, but they just weren't willing to spend it. Part of the reason was because there were players coming back from the war who were then competing with the players who were playing during the war. So they had a surplus of players, and they could play the players off against each other. And they've always been pretty successful in doing that kind of thing. It was also taboo back then to discuss your salary. So you didn't have players, sitting around saying, "Well, what are you getting? What are you getting?" Because the owners play the players off in this regard, and they were afraid that maybe they were getting more than their fellow player, and that they'd have to, take a pay cut the next time because everyone would find out. So it was a pretty clever game.
Was that a product of the culture in baseball, or was that, you have this context of American what's going on? Was that a cultural thing just across America that you don't talk about what you're making, you keep that kind of stuff private?
Yeah, maybe there's a little bit of that helped to cement it. But there was a lot of labor agitation going on at the time. So there was also a background of workers saying, "Hey, we scaled back our demands for decent wages and decent benefits during the war as a sort of patriotic gesture, but the war is over, and we'd like to get what we deserve." And so there was an enormous amount of labor activism in the years right after the war, and I think there's some evidence that Gardella was influenced by this, at least in part, and it. I see a parallel here because, Kurt Flood later said that he was influenced by the social movements of the 1960s to do what he did. And I think Gardella was influenced by some of the labor agitation going on. The only question is, why was he so alone in baseball in not really being influenced by this kind of thing? Well, Flood felt like he was pretty alone too for a while. So
What, so all these people are against him. Players come out, the people who were banned with him are against him. What actually turned things around to make uh, Chandler, the commissioner, suddenly frightened and to the degree that they were wanting to settle?
well, the um, a big factor here was Gardella's attorney, a guy named Fred Johnson. Fred Johnson had written about the reserve clause and about the baseball's business model. And so he wasn't just any lawyer. He was someone who was pretty dedicated to trying to do something about what he thought was this injustice in the baseball contract. the they filed a case because it was unequal, and also that it was a violation of the antitrust laws, and that baseball ought to be covered by the antitrust laws. Um, Gardella lost the case initially, but then it was appealed to the federal district court for the Second Circuit, and the owners were pretty confident that they would just that court would just sort of defer to the 1922 Supreme Court decision, which had exempted baseball from the antitrust, and they were shocked when the court did just the opposite. And two of the judges on the court, a guy named Jerome Frank and Leonard Hand, turned out to be among the most esteemed judges in American history. So these were not just any judges, and they just completely condemned the reserve clause. And they said that this was a peonage system, this was akin to slavery, it was probably in violation of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. And so now you have this victory for the first time in a federal court, the first and only time, really, for a challenge to the reserve clause and the antitrust exemption. So the court, the appeals court, then sent the case back to the trial court for a new trial. And that's when Major League Baseball stepped in and started making offers to Gardella and the lawyer to buy this off, because they didn't want this to be affirmed in a trial court as an additional precedent. And so they offered some money. It was pushed aside, but eventually Gardella and his lawyer decided to take it. Gardella was not in a good financial situation. He was quite convinced that he was going to be blacklisted again, and so he accepted the settlement. And unfortunately, what that did is it prevented baseball from having to act to change the contract. It was a stepping stone, but nevertheless, it didn't force them immediately to do something about this.
Well, that's a great, like the details in the story really highlight, like we often get these myths, these legends of people making these huge changes, but it's really human. For me, also going back to, in your book, you talked about Gardella. He was angry about the contract that he initially received, and like his anger came out, and then I don't know if it was the manager or the owners said, uh, well, hell with you then, and then he said, I would have accepted it, it's like he would have come back and accepted it, but at that point it was too late. So there, it
Right.
wasn't like he was just really standing up for principle at that point. um his hand was forced. And then here, it's like, okay, what would have happened if he would have, in the face of financial difficulty, if he would have stayed strong, but he couldn't, because the reality was he needed money. He had a family. What did he have? 10 children, right? Eventually. So
He
he
did,
had to
yes, he did.
he had to just make these hard decisions. And I mean, I don't know what he like if he would have held out. Do you have an opinion on what might have happened? I know it's, conjecture.
Yeah, sure. Well, he said later that he didn't feel like he had a choice. He also felt like he sold out. And so it was like, well, I really wish I didn't have to do that, but I felt like I had to do that at the time. And so, well, I think he would have had a good chance of winning the case, but I do think he would have been blacklisted again, because as a part of the settlement, he really was blacklisted again. He was reinstated to Major League Baseball and signed by the St. Louis Cardinals, but he got one at bat. He was demoted not just to AAA, but also down to AA. And then a month later, he was released, and the claim was made that there were no other teams that were interested in his skills. And it just defied credibility, but no one would touch him. And so he was right in that. So I think in a certain sense, I think he made the right decision. But it would have been interesting if he was able to stick to completing the case, whether it could have broken open the reserve clause for free agency maybe sooner. What did happen is that Gardella versus Chandler federal court decision became an important part of the arguments for probably 2 dozen subsequent cases in the next 15 years before flood came along. There was repeated additional challenges in baseball, but also challenges to the reserve clause and to antitrust violation issues in the National Hockey League, in the National Football League, in the boxing industry, and even in the dog show industry. You find all these cases where Gardella versus Chandler is the basis for their making this argument. And in baseball, all these new cases were bought off until finally you get the Curt Flood case in 1969 and 1970. And the basis for Flood's suit that went all the way to the Supreme Court was Gardella versus Chandler, was the arguments that the judges made in that federal suit. So it really had it took on a life of its own afterwards, and that's part of the reason why I think Gardella deserves at least some acknowledgement, some credit for sort of getting the ball rolling on the free agency quest by the ball players.
Yeah, I mean, considering what he did, I was surprised. Are you familiar with the baseball reliquary?
Yeah.
I'm surprised he isn't a member of the Shrine of Eternals, and you know,
Well, it's funny you mentioned that because for the first time he was on the ballot just this past one, and it was on the
okay,
ballot because I asked to put him on the
okay,
ballot, and
okay,
they were happy to do it, but he didn't win. No one wins the first time, so we'll see if he gets it somewhere down the road.
yeah,
Yeah, it would be
okay,
nice for his story to be more widely known, and I think the reliquary would be a perfect place to start.
yeah. I mean, this you also mentioned. I mean, one of the reasons that Major League Baseball gave for holding up the reserve clause was that it would create an imbalance, right? It would create an unfairness. And meanwhile, you have the New York Yankees winning the World Series or making it to the World Series every year. And then, I just took a peek and after Curt Flood, they definitely drop off, especially, this happened in the 70s and the 1980s. Do you see a connection there?
Well, yeah, they made that claim, but it was hardly credible because you had all these teams, not just the Yankees, but the New York teams generally were dominating. So how could you say there's competitive balance when you've got all these teams already under your system? And then after free agency, if you look at those years, the next couple of decades, there's more diversity than really in the entire previous history of Major League Baseball in terms of the teams that are competitive, and get into the playoffs and get into the World Series or win the World Series. So the idea that the reserve clause in the contract was keeping competitive balance really was just to the contrary on a certain level. Now, I do think, however, there's an issue that it's great that the players are making so much money. The owners are also making a ton of money, so it did cause them to be poor. Um, but the prices are high, right? And I think the part, and even Gardella said this at one point, is that well, the only other thing is the fans. The fans are paying a lot more money now to go to the ballpark, and so, I think that ought to be taken into consideration. Is when are the fans going to get a better deal as compared to the players who have been now enjoying this for well, it's now 50 years. This is the 50th year since the breakthrough, and I don't think it's by putting a cap on the salaries unless there's going to be a cap on the profits. Something has to be equal, I think, between the owners and the players if there's going to be a cutting down. The luxury tax hasn't done the trick, so something else would have to be devised.
Well, I mean that's interesting, and I did a series on the Black Sox of 1919 and all that, you know, came from that, all that went into it, and this idea of owners just turning a blind eye and not facing the reality so that they could actually take control and do something that made sense. And here's the same thing happens. They wait so long to do nothing, and suddenly the doors are open, and it feels like now they've gone off the deep end because they didn't
Hmm.
take the opportunity to take control.
Exactly. A lot of short-term thinking and not, long-term health of the sport, basically.
So you're saying no salary cap, do something about prices and profits that maybe would create less profit and more balance.
I mean, I don't have a blueprint for this, but there are models, that other countries use for certain industries where they put a cap on profits, and then anything excess to that goes back to let's say, for example, in Germany, they've had this for the insurance industry that if the companies in the insurance industry make over a certain amount of profit, and it's a good profit, it's a reasonable amount of profit, but after that it's sort of considered to be gouging. If they go over, then they have to return the excess to the premium holders. And so there's something that says that, it's not just the workers who need to cap their salaries, but the owners who are, swimming in money. I mean, I think now that it's 24 of the 30 teams are owned by billionaires. So these guys have an enormous amount of money. They don't have to keep gouging the fans at the ballpark, or with them, for the merchandise or whatever they're making their money on.
Right, right. Yeah, that's really interesting. And it seems more straightforward with your example with the insurance versus, you know, a sport or entertainment where it's, I don't know, more amorphous, like where that money
Hmm.
would go back to.
Yeah, well, that's true. That's true.
Uh,
Yeah, as I say, I don't have the answer here, but I think I'm hearing lately, well, the players need to have a cap on their salaries with no sort of focus on, well, what about the profits that are being made by the owners? So
yeah,
I think it ought to be more equitable.
yeah. That's fascinating. So what happened to Danny Gardella? So after, after he gets what ultimately, what was it, $29,000 he came away with from the lawsuit?
Yeah, yeah. They gave him 60,000, but he had to split it in half with his attorney, and then he had to pay off another attorney for an additional 1,000. So yeah, so he had $29,000, and he used part of that to buy a house. And then he made an attempt to pursue his singing career. He did play some baseball in the minor leagues, and back in Canada again for a short period. But then he switched over and was hoping for a music career. He had, a number of club dates, and was on the vaudeville circuit for a while. He made a shot at going back to boxing because he was a Golden Gloves boxer. But none of these really sustain themselves. And so for most of the rest of his life, he was working blue collar jobs. He worked in factories. He went back and worked at the Al Ruins gym as a trainer. He worked some farming jobs up in upstate New York. He eventually worked at a warehouse over in Queens for many years, where he was involved actually in another labor protest over there when they were trying to close down that plant. He also became very religious in his later life. So that was a very important part of his life. He would get requests for autographs, for example, and photos, and he'd send them out, but he'd always put some kind of biblical reading, little thing underneath his signature. So religion was really important to him, and I sort of take this as maybe that was something that satisfied his quest, this nonstop quest that he was always looking for something, and maybe that was part of what satisfied that, in his later life. He did have 10 kids, and I think 27, 25 or 27 grandkids. So he had a big family. Lived a long life, lived till he was 85. He died in 2005.
Like at the time, it's interesting because he was so into all these different things, but psychology, philosophy, poetry. You think like with the amount of knowledge that he'd accumulated, he would have been able to uh, pursue a degree or a path in one of those areas. And I wonder if he just didn't think of it, if those doors were closed to him. And like, do you know if
Yeah.
he ever
Well,
considered those things?
I don't think he ever did. I couldn't find any evidence that he did. I don't think he was um, really thrilled with organized education, but yeah, I don't think he really seriously considered it. I think he just okay, I gave that a shot, and I guess I'm just a working class guy, and I'm back to my blue collar roots basically with these jobs.
The other thing that stands out to me is, he was so health conscious with diet and weight training, and he seemed to understand a lot more uh, than what was commonly known at the time. And he wanted to go back into boxing, right? Like, where people were
Yeah,
constantly
that's
punching you in
right.
the head.
Yeah. Well, he was a little, he was a little old for in by boxing standards, a little bit old to be thinking about that. But no, he certainly did continue the nutrition stuff with a vengeance, and his wife also was into it, so he didn't have to fight against what was going on at home. They both were into it, and he also maintained a pretty vigorous weight training, and his backyard was basically a gym. With barbells and all these things back there to just keep in shape, and he really ingrained that into his kids as well.
So, I mean, this is a really interesting story, not only Gardella and his life, but all the social institutional issues that surrounded him. Is there anything else that you'd like to add before we end today?
Well, just to go back to one thing, I think that it's interesting the way he was criticized for challenging baseball because he was uh, he was viewed as if there was a sort of political element to it. So he was called a communist. He was red baited, and this is right amidst the time after World War II when all of the anti-communist hysteria is emerging, and you have the House Un-American Activities Committee. You've got the McCarthy hearings, and so in a way, baseball is reflecting what's going on in the broader society, and it's very easy for the owners to be using that kind of narrative to condemn what he was doing. It's un-American, and you're a communist for challenging the baseball model because baseball is true blood America, and so I think that's another important piece of what he was sort of fighting against during that time.
Yeah. I mean, it's so irritating. It's like, and who was it? Branch Rickey was one of the people who, would say you're anti-com or you're communist because you're doing these things, and it feels like such
Yes,
low-hanging fruit, to
yes,
and
I
it's
know.
so easy then to discredit someone or defame someone through those means.
Right. Yeah. Well, and so hypocritical, because he plucked Jackie Robinson from the Negro Leagues without paying for him, and then he's blaming Jorge Pascal and Gardella for jumping to another league, and it just seemed like it was fine for him, but not not for anyone else, not for anyone who might challenge his model, his business model.
Yeah.
I guess the only other thing I would say in the end is that I think that uh, many times we think of change as occurring just at the moment, one particular moment when things change. So a lot of people, and when they think of the free agency battle, they think about the decision made by Peter Seitz, the arbitrator, in the case of Andy Messersmith and Dave McNally in 1975. And well, that's what created free agency. And of course, that is what created free agency for those, those two players, and then it was incorporated into the contract the following year. But just because you, in a sense, weren't in the room where it happened, didn't mean that you didn't make a contribution along the way to make this happen, even if it required several more years before it actually happened. So I think it's important to think about that. In the book, I point out how Martin Luther King was saying that, I could never have accomplished as much as I did for the civil rights movement if it wasn't for Jackie Robinson starting that process back in the late 1940s. And so, Robinson wasn't in the room when the civil rights legislation was passed, but I think he deserves some credit for getting the ball rolling. And that's all I'd like to see for Gardella, is some recognition that there were others involved much earlier in starting this process.
Yeah, I mean that goes on. I'm doing a two-part series on Kennesaw Mountain Atlantis right now, and just this idea of what was happening then, parallels to today, and those who, uh, I mean, paraphrasing, those who are ignorant to history are doomed to repeat it. But yeah, I mean, like what you're saying is so important, not only to recognize all the steps that had taken place, but if you're doing something today and you feel like it's daunting, right? It is important to be a step in the process and to recognize that, like as motivation to keep moving forward versus, I can't do this. It's not going to change anything. So I think that is a really important message.
That's right. So it's not just looking backward, but thinking forward as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Rob. I really enjoyed this conversation. It went in a lot of really interesting directions. And is there anything else about where people could find it? Amazon, but any other uh, information?
Yeah, of course, it's on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. I'll send you. I have a discount form that I can send you, and people want to get a little bit of a break on the price. I can send you that as well.
Okay. All right, Rob. Have a good weekend.
Okay. Okay. You too. Thank you.
Bye.